Welcome back, Gophers. Uh, we got some changes here. I posted a short yesterday. Unfortunately, most of the day got taken up by errands, so I couldn't jump on. It doesn't mean we didn't make anything; just meant I didn't have a chance to show it with you live. Um, but basically, the idea was, what if we changed the encoding scheme of the events instead of GOB, which is binary, we changed it to JSON. Yes, there's a performance trade-off from using JSON instead of GOB, and we also lose type information if we go to JSON instead of GOB. But what we get in return is JSON is a supported type, a native supported type of SQLite and Postgres if we ever decide to go to Postgres um, as our database of choice, which we can do, by the way. The fact that I'm using SQLite now, um, SQL C supports both. So all I have to do is basically say, hey, we're using Postgres, and it should just all work. Um, I hope. But yeah, it should just work just fine because most of our actual database layer is done through code generation, which is cool. I wonder if I even can support both, but we can get there if and when we get there. But what that means is that we'll actually be able to dive into the events in a query and query for elements of that event. So a good example is, let's say I want to make it where right now, every time there's a check in heard, we re-verify. Is that necessary? Maybe, maybe not. But what we can do if we have the ability to dive into events efficiently, we can have it go, okay, the call sign hasn't changed. When someone's checked in a second time or a third, fourth, whatever, the call sign hasn't changed. So we don't need to re-verify. And we still have their name and everything like that. We're just changing going from an ACK to a NAC, basically, a non-acknowledgement. Um, so we don't necessarily need to re-verify. So we could do all the detection through a bunch of schemes, or we can just say when we validate when we hear when we're processing the check and heard event, let's query the database for a check and heard of the current session and see, hey, is this one that we heard a different call sign? If it's a different call sign or whatever other logic we have, we should re-verify. If it's not, we don't need to re-verify, so we're good. Um, while yes, we are caching quite a bit, um, I think it'd be better to be more efficient in general and just say, hey, we don't need to even emit this event anymore. We don't need to process it. Uh, the conditions aren't met to process the event. Or if we want to use the events to track logins and sessions, we might want to say, hey, uh, what are all of the sessions created or logins coming from a specific IP? If we don't have the ability to dive into that event and see and query by the contents of the event, then we end up with a situation where how would we get that information out? We have to get every single event that ever occurred of that type, unmarshal or decode every single one. Like, we basically have to implement that stuff ourselves instead of letting the database do it for us. So while we do give up some performance by going to using the regular JSON um, marshaling instead of GOB, what we get is a pretty decent set of capabilities for the application. And there are alternative implementations of JSON encoding and marshaling and unmarshaling should we get to that point where our issue is a JSON encode or decode. Maybe it is. Maybe we'll be that lucky and we'll be able to sorry, excuse me, where that will be the bottleneck, right? Um Solvable problem. And it's a good problem. So the other challenge is with JSON, it doesn't have the type. So gob has the type information, so I can decode the gob into an interface, and I actually have the underlying type. So I have to come up with some sort of jiggery pokery stuff, some workaround to the fact that I don't have native type information directly in the encoding scheme. But we already have that in a sense because we know the type because we're tracking that in the event. We're tracking the name of the um, type. So, for example, the events package, we have a check and herd. So it'll be events.net check and herd. That's stored in the database. We can query by it. We have that information available to us. Uh, and we can do a wee bit of reflection if necessary, um, which managed to do it mostly without reflection, um, which is cool. And we'll be able to work around that, I think. Um, so I want to show you what I came up with, and I want to show you the profile editing editor that I came up with as well. Um, Made that recently. Um, so let's dive right in. So as promised, okay, let's look at this event SQL for example. On the left here, we can use SQLite's JSON extract function. So we're saying the column here is event data. This is the extraction. Dollar sign is the root. That's its path form syntax, and at call sign. SQL C gets a little. I'm gonna say I hesitate to say confused, but you need to give it a name. It doesn't handle the fact like because this isn't just event data. It's a complex function, so you need to give it a name for it to be happy. That's about it, right? I did have to do a migration to make this work, to change the encoding, and I can show you that migration. I did it as a three-part migration. So first, I added a new field, a new column. That was step one. Step two, read every single event that's in gob. Read every single event, re-encode it into JSON, store that, and then step three is move the column, basically drop the old column that had gob and rename the new column back in. So it's a three-part um, thing. It's a pretty common pattern used in lots of places, and not just databases. So yeah, we can get the event out, which is cool. And if we want to see what that looks like just in practice, um, we have, hey, find events for call sign. We have a function now that'll help us out. We can get any event type we want by a certain call sign. Obviously, it would have to have the call sign for it to work. Otherwise, it's not going to be useful. Um, but we also could maybe extend this to a more generic sense and saying, like, give me the actual query, like the path information that you want to add into that JSON extract. But for now, this is fine. I was able to test it, see that it works. That's cool. So how do we make this work? How do we get around the fact that we don't have that type information? So what I came up with is on the right here. Um, First, I have a registrant, which is just a placeholder of a bunch of information that we need about stuff that's registered. We have a registry, pretty straightforward, a map of registrants. Um, and this is really the trick. Um, let's talk about these things here, and you'll see them in practice just below. We have a function called new in there that just returns a new instance of that type. It's any because it's just passed through an interface, but we can do a type assertion um, later on. I'm okay with that because the type information is in there, even if it's in the container of just a generic interface. So I'm okay with that. Friendly name, like I put in the documentation. This is so that if I want to if we ever want to expose this either in log files or directly to the user or an API or something like that, um, in theory, we can just use user dot session underscore created. It lets us just have a little bit more friendly form than this second one, which is the name. I don't necessarily want to expose what package the event came from directly to the user. That's an internal implementation detail. Um, so this is a little more user friendly. These two functions here are really the magic. We can use generics here. So I have a generic. For some reason I use K. I could use T. I have a habit of using K. Um, I think it comes from the Ruby days of uh, whenever you needed to do like some meta programming, you would use class with a K. So in my mind, if I'm doing generics or like meta programming, class with a K. Um, and it stands out a little bit more to me. Um, and then we give it a friendly. I do register it. I have to dereference it because new returns a pointer to that type, which is cool, exactly what we need. But I want to dereference it so that I can register it appropriately. We want to get the name. Again, we want events.user created, not asterisk or star events.user created, because we don't want to get the fact that it's a pointer in the name, just to preserve our existing everything. And then we just create a function that just calls new on it. Um, and we basically record all that information and we build that function out. Grant, the only real reflection is here with the name, which, like um, I've mentioned before, that happens at uh, compile time. So I'm not too worried about that. We're not going to be doing it a bunch, just like we're only going to register it once. In fact, we could wrap this in a um, sync once. So we could have like a sync once or a collection of sync onces from the atomic package to make sure we only do this one time. I'm not too worried about it right now. We'll see. Then we can go to our registry. We can take our kind string, which would be events.user_created or events um, net check and heard, and the data from uh, that we need to unserialize, and we just basically use this to get that type. So we restore the type information. So now we can dynamically collect the type, and then on Marshall, like usual, pass that information along. This is fairly straightforward. Really, the trick or the magic here is this registry and the fact that I have a function called new, and that is set up through generics. Uh, that simplifies this quite a bit, right? I can have a simple register function that still registers with gob so that we can do things like our migrations, we can move stuff around, or if we do choose to gob encode things that's still used around the system, and I want to make that available, it doesn't really cost very much to register to register these events for gob. We're just not going to use that to persist it to the database. And then we can decode it. And again, we just have just basically accessors to get into those registries. So if we want to know the friendly name or the event name for a specific kind, uh, we can. This one, now that I think about it, is kind of silly because you give it the events.user created and whatever. Is it silly? It's kind of silly. Um, but I have it mostly just to have. Um, and how does that play out in the real world? So you notice this is nothing changed here very much. We use a JSON Marshall instead of a gob encode. We passed that along, and we had to do a little bit of. I'm not super enthused about this hack. Basically, I want to make sure that it always is the same to consumers because we are going to be republishing it. That um, I decode the recently encoded thing. Um, so there's a price to pay for that. Um, Everything else is kind of the same. Um, because everything else still takes models.event and everything else still deals with events. Just like before, the only real tweak that I had to do that I couldn't quite get around was when we process, when we're applying events and we're doing a type switch on it. Come on. Is now an event stream. Slow down. Stop. Hey, you. We'll get it'll stop loading eventually. There we go. Is now it's a pointer to the event. That's it. The asterisk. Quite I haven't quite figured out how to make that asterisk go away. But I gave myself a time box. I said, "Hey, let's see if I can figure out a nice way to do this that doesn't require a tremendous amount of reflection or anything like that." This is what I came up with. I was willing to deal with that compromise, but everything else is the same. Um, and we can see that in action. Let's see. We can open up the database here, and we can say, "Okay, this is that exact query. I copied it and just filled it in, and we can look for check-ins, and hey, look, we can get all the check-ins." Of course, I ended up nuking the database by mistake. It happens, but it's all testing, so it's fine. Um, so we can see that check-in, which is cool. We actually could query based on the information embedded within. Um, and that also opens up, knowing that we can store in JSON. There's something I want to show you. Um, it's actually very helpful to be able to do, I think. Also, in that process, I just wanted to share this. Uh, like I said, what I had done was I was testing that I could, because I was doing a Go based migration for the first time. I wasn't sure if it would work with the fact that, hey, I just completely retook the event system. I want to make sure migrations still work. So I ended up moving some database file internals around, and I accidentally deleted everything. But in that process, um, I had the application running. I had the database open. Now SQLite can only be opened by one process at a time, which isn't a problem for us in this case. Um, but I was just kind of inspecting things, and I saw an error come through that it couldn't, as you can see here, right? It couldn't publish an event the way that it wanted to, um, and then it ended up recovering, which was kind of nice to see. This was our circuit breaker in action, recovering from an error that I caused, which is kind of neat. Let's exit full screen here. So we can see, oops, did I just nuke it again? No, I didn't. Okay, good, good, good. I thought I broke everything again. No, I didn't. But let's exit the database because we don't need to cause ourselves problems. Okay, so this works just like before, right? I can do hmm, AJ4JG. Yeah, that's a guy. Um, it works, right? It all still functions over here. Now, one of the things that I was struggling with was, this is what another advantage of having JSON is this radio settings section. There are many different types of ham radios and technologies. There's digital, and there's multiple different kinds of digital. There's DMR, there's Yaesu, there's uh, System Fusion, or something like that. Anyways, there's many of them, and a net can exist across multiple technologies. Especially if there's relays or if it's DMR, you could have, let's say, a local repeater that's DMR capable that's also tied with a DMR ID that you can join via the internet. So you can take your local handheld ham radio. It can go through, let's say, a small radio that's connected to a Raspberry Pi, and then that can bounce to the internet. And now you've joined a ham radio net. That is, half of the people could be local, and the other half could be bounced through the internet. And they have different ways to connect. So how do you have all these different types of random settings? Well, guess what? We can just store it as JSON. We can then have a similar way that we do events. We can say the kind is a um, analog radio. We go, okay, cool. Now we know what keys we expect. We can pull it all out. Um, that's kind of where I'm going with that. Um, and even this, you could see these this ham this net, this repeater, they have 2 set up. They have the primary and the backup, and they have different settings. In this case, they have a different tone, but they also could have a third attribute on there that it's required in order to get running. They could have a split tone, which in which case means you have a in your radio, you would configure one tone to communicate with the um, repeater and one code to hear the repeater coming back. Uh, how would you represent that? Would you have to have 1,000 columns in the database for all the different combinatoric combinations? No. Instead, we can just store it as JSON. We should be good to go. It's good enough for this. And I think that's a good use case for that. Um, we spoke last time about a profile. We made the edit profile button. And if you notice, now I have a fancy pants control here. This is cool. I like Markdown. Engineer, it's just comes par for the course. Um, Even though I like Markdown, I still want to be able to preview it sometimes. So I wanted to be able to have a preview available because I like to think I'm tech savvy. Even so, I said I still make Markdown mistakes. Um, I like seeing it too. That's nice. The users who are going to be using this application may not know Markdown. That's fine. I want to still expose that to them, so if they want to use it, they can. So this way they can get a preview. I have a little thing here with a link to a docs page that still to be written. I'm going to collect a bunch of information from other folks um, in order how to write Markdown the way that we want. Um, you know, so hey, yeah, we got this thing. We can preview it. Oh, look, it worked. And the cool thing is, I didn't write any JavaScript for this. I did not write any a single line of JavaScript to make this entire thing work. It is all done through HTMX. And if the event stuff didn't excite you, this stuff hopefully should because this is really cool. The tabs, HTMX. The UI, HTMX. The there's CSS to make these things look pretty and they give us this like view that's very I basically just I looked at the way the GitHub one. I'm not gonna I use that one all the time. I'm used to it. I think it's a very fantastic implementation. So I was heavily inspired by the GitHub one. I did not copy any of the actual CSS. I just saw the way it looked and recreated something similar. Um, and it works. And then if I refresh it, that's there. If I just do this to make it, if I go to preview, they can say there's nothing to preview. Um, and if we go to a cool site, Filorama, uh, basically all this does is it can take like here Monty Python. There, I copied a ton of Markdown from Monty Python. I can paste this in here, and now we have a bunch of test um, Monty Python, and I can save that and view it. It worked. We still need to do some flash messaging. Still need to make it apparent that it actually saved, uh, but it looks it works, um, which is fun. Uh, and we get Markdown editing. So let me show you what that looks like real quick. Um, and because the other thing I want to get to um, later today, the next live, because it's just how it goes. I don't want to keep these things too long, keep them focused. Um, I want to deal with the fact that the Chrome up here it doesn't actually do anything. Um, and we have to find a nice reusable way to do it. But let me show you how this stuff works real quick. Um, because I thought it was pretty clever, but I wrote it, so um, there's that. Uh, oops. Okay, and markdown and handler markdown. Okay, so it looks pretty big here because I'm quite zoomed in. Uh, Come on. I render the entire thing as it is here. I'll put it up side by side. Render the entire thing here, all the HTML, all this thing as one giant static thingamajig. And there's a link here. This is a link that sends an HTMX request to a handler that renders the markdown and re-renders the entire control, generates the entire control in this mode with the preview. And it makes the right a link that does the same thing in reverse and puts it back to an input. That's that's what HTMX lets me do. So I have a bunch of logic here to on the left. These are the buttons, like which mode are we in? So I basically have added something to the an input attribute to say, hey, I'm in edit mode, markdown mode. Okay, are we markdown mode preview? Yes or no? If we're not in preview, that means we're in write mode, so we're going to show writing. If we're in preview mode, we're not going to show the. We're going to change which one's active, and we're not going to make it an H. We're not going to make it a link. Um, I came up with some like if I choose to do bold text and all this sort of stuff, I'd have to write JavaScript for that. I don't think I can just insert an element quite like that. So I did it as part of the design, but I'm not quite ready to use it. So I have this if false prevent it from being rendered. And then the help is just a link. And it's just a text editor. It's just a text area. And here, this is the thing. If it's markdown preview, then I render this and I have some CSS on the preview to uh when we're in when it's there, I basically put it on top of everything and render it. And I display none the input and I um, display block the other one. I just swap out the CSS elements. Um, and this way, even no matter which mode it's in, the input data is still there. So if you hit save, it'll still work. Um, and then the other interesting magic that I did was uh, I added the ability to uh, I'm taking all the things that the view model did, all of its settings, and sending it to the server to tell it how to re-render it the second time. And I do that by encoding it with something called Bronca. Um, can I jump to this? Yeah. So I basically set up a Bronca token. Uh, Bronca is a really interesting way to make a cryptographically signed token that you can have any type you want, whatever any type of struct or whatever. You can encode it with a random key that's yours. So I have that stored in the config. We ensure that we have a random key when the system starts up, and I can change that. Um, it'd be not so great to change that because then we lose a bunch of stuff, but that's okay. Could lose stuff. Uh, and then I just encode the whole thing into this random gobbledygook like a CSRF token, include it as a hidden input field, and give it a special name. I do the same thing and in reverse, right? Get a Bronca token, decode it, read it back out, turn it back into an into attribute, so that the handler can actually process it. And on the right hand, we have a handler with two and a half endpoints because one is a goes to a help page. There's not really going to be any logic there. Um, we have two posts. One's the preview and one's the editor mode. We give it the name. The name is the field that we should be looking at. So it's the name in the form because w- um, HTMX will send us the entire form. So this way we can say, I care about this element. We pull that out. We decode the input attributes as I discussed, as we have on the left here. And then we switch a couple modes. And then we have a service that actually does markdown rendering. Set that to the body and just render the view. Editor, kind of the same. Um, and we just disable the fact that we're in current markdown preview mode and we render the view. Pretty simple. And on the left, I'll show you the service. Um, it's basic. I got Goldmark to do uh, the markdown rendering, and I also have a sanitizer called Blue Monday. Um, and what that does is this way, if someone tries injecting stuff into that text area, and I do need to expose that to every single form, so every single form gets sanitized automatically. Um, we probably can add a middleware for that. It's probably the best way to do it is that you actually sanitize the before we even see it. I'll have to play with it and see, hey, how does that work with forms? We'll play with that, see if we can make it more secure. Um, and then we just have a bunch of helpers do rendering where we just do the rendering and we have all the extensions turned on, and then we sanitize it and it strips out all the bad stuff. There probably are other packages. I'm just familiar with these. I've used them before. They work pretty great. Um, a- and that's it. I mean, there's a bunch of CSS. There's like a lot of CSS. Um, but HTMX lets us do this really cool stuff, and I don't have to write JavaScript. I can just let do it all with Go. I can do, and I use Temple to do that to actually do the rendering and the logic. So that's a very a pleasure to work with. But we're able to build this really cool thing. So um, we're almost coming up on time for this. I want to be mindful, trying to keep these focused, especially the review ones. When we're doing like more of a review, I want to keep it 30 to 45 minutes max. Um, and but it does help me to review this stuff because it helps me think what's going on, prime stuff, anything like that. The next thing that we need to do is I want to tackle this Chrome up top. There's a couple different things I want to be able to do. I want to be able to change these things, the links that are shown up top. That should depend on the page that you're on. So if you are on um, an organization page, maybe it's a few of their links. If you are on a net page, maybe that should be like information about the net, the sessions of the net, that sort of thing. I want that to be context dependent. Um, and then I also want to be able to, should we choose to, I'm still debating on this. Um, have it that when you hit net control, you get a slide out menu. That would be cool. I'm not sure what I put in there yet, but I want to see if that's the capability. And account, I want to do something similar where if you click account, it will show you very much like GitHub or other sites. I use GitHub a lot, so I take a lot of inspiration from them. Um, where if you click account, it'll show you, let's say, uh, it'll have a thing that like a panel that opens and will say like go to your profile, log out, go to your settings, all that sort of fun stuff. We need to take care of that, and I think I want to do that next time. And then after that, the next step will be finishing up the rest of the profile page. Uh, and I think the first thing I want to tackle, because that'll have the most wide-reaching consequences, is going to be choosing the time zone. I want to control how we render time, and we'll see how that works across the page. Because let me take my through my thinking there. Could we make the first thing that you see here email addresses? Absolutely. But I don't care about email addresses right now. Like, I'm only using an email address to do the login. I'm not sending messages or notifications or anything like that. So the only thing that would be impacted design-wise of email addresses is this page. Time zone, on the other hand, that's a challenge because I have to have the ability to choose a time zone in the profile thing. Have to be able to collect those settings across the entire application. Have to make it so every single view uses those settings. So you see where how it like it exposes a flaw, something missing, and it will set the stage and let us figure out how do we do things like this across the board. How do we do other things that um, come from settings? Because the next we're gonna have coming up very soon. We're gonna have permissions. So permissions is more like time zone settings than it is like a name setting or an email address setting. So by figuring out something relatively simple, I hope, of time and how a user wants their time displayed, I think we'll be able to find the patterns that we need to use, architecturally speaking, in order to figure out how to implement permissions in part. So next time, Chrome, and then that would be episode 10, which would be cool. And then 11 will probably focus on time zones. So with that, I appreciate you. I enjoy doing these things. Um, I hope they get some value. If you've made it this far, I appreciate it. Um, and as always, you can view the source of everything we've done and everything you see. GitHub.com, Ryan Fairman /netctl, spelled netctl, pronounced net control. And if you have any questions, concerns, comments, leave them down below, or by all means, make a pull request. We'll review it together. I think that would be great fun. And if you have any questions or ideas, feel free to drop it as an issue in GitHub as well. With that, be well.